As I mentioned in my previous video, one of the highlights of the World Neolithic Congress that took place in the first week of November was the excursion that took place on the Wednesday, November 6th. Conference registrants were divided up into different groups and they visited the sites in a different order, but my particular group went first to the site of Cyborg, which up to now was quite well known in the media for the discovery relief on a bench in one of the large circular structures that was partly covered by a modern house, and this relief showed a man in the middle grasping his penis, flanked by two leopards that appeared to be, walking towards him or perhaps attacking him. However, we soon discovered that there was a lot more to the site of Cyborg than we imagined. As I mentioned, the various groups were distributed across a number of buses, and my group traveled west a little over 20 kilometers to the village of Cyborg, in the foothills of the eastern Taurus Mountains. Near the highway, it was pretty industrial, but the village itself has mostly traditional architecture, much of it consisting of buildings erected when the village was founded in the mid-20th century. These have stone foundations and sometimes nice limestone ashlar masonry. I noticed that quite a few of the houses, even the more recent ones, had large domed bread ovens attached to one of the outer walls. More on that later when I talk about Karahan Tepe. After we exited the buses, the group made its way up the path to the northern excavation area, where that relief of the leopards flanking a penis-gripping man had been discovered in 1921, carved into the bench of a large circular building. It was only partially exposed back then because two modern houses covered most of it, the older one of stone and another of concrete. Dr. Eylem Özdoğan, who directs the excavations at Cyborg, was on hand to tell visitors about the excavation and her interpretation of the finds. Aside from Dr. Özdoğan, we were also greeted by a very friendly and playful dog that appears to be something like a mascot to the excavations. The first thing that was noticeable was that the modern houses have been demolished and all traces removed, and the excavated area has been widened considerably. The entirety of the Neolithic structure was now exposed, showing not only the famous relief and the relief to its left, showing another man facing off a charging aurochs. The floor and benches were cut into the limestone bedrock, and the structure is about 14 meters in diameter. We could see bases where the two central pillars had once stood, while another pillar, at least its lower part, was still standing and appeared to be a later feature. There were also some pits cut into the floor. The raised benches were well preserved on the west and north sides of the ancient structure, where they are about 70 centimeters high, although damaged in places by post-Neolithic disturbances. By contrast, the bench is very low on the east and south sides. Most likely, there were once pillars founded on the bench at intervals around the periphery, but these have not survived. In one place, you could see the likely location of one such pillar. The lithic assemblage associated with deposits in the building reportedly indicates a likely date in the early pre-pottery Neolithic B, around 8500 BC. Dr. Özdoğan gave visitors her account of the reliefs, which she interprets it as having a narrative structure. In other words, she thinks that both the leopard panel and the one with the aurochs are scenes in a single story. That's one possibility, which she supports by the fact that the leopards appear ready to attack and that the man in the scene at left seems poised to confront an aurochs, its horns threatening, while he brandishes what might be a sling. Personally, I'm not totally convinced by this argument, or even that the aurochs scene was meant to be viewed in the same context as the rearing leopards. Certainly they're side by side, but the execution of the aurochs scene seemed to me less skilled than the leopard one, and I'd speculate that it was done at a different time. The leopards flank the facing man in a way that's reminiscent of heraldry, making me wonder if the leopard is a totem or a symbol for the man's lineage. Although we have to keep in mind that it's a little bit anachronistic to think of heraldry, perhaps, in the Neolithic. The fact that the relief emphasizes the man's genitalia could likewise symbolize the man's role as the progenitor of that lineage, which would also suggest that it's a patrilineage, descent through male ancestors. The aurochs scene, meanwhile, seems to be in the same tradition as the bull baiting scenes at Çatalhöyük, and perhaps memorializes an aurochs hunt and the subsequent feast. That in itself would be a sort of a story, but not a narrative in the sense of a graphic novel-like series of scenes. Of course, all these interpretations are speculative, and alternative ones will no doubt emerge as time goes by. The big square block currently on the Neolithic floor actually pertains to Roman-era quarrying activity at the site, still visible in the form of rectilinear cuts into the bedrock in several places at the site. We're fortunate that this quarrying did not damage the Neolithic relief, and I can't help but wonder what the Roman quarrymen must have thought of the ancient sculptures that they surely must have noticed during their work. The excavations have also exposed the bedrock floor of a neighboring circular structure, not as well preserved as the one with the relief. I would imagine that it suffered more from the activities of the Roman quarrymen. After we had examined the northern excavation area pretty extensively, we headed back first toward the buses, but found ourselves led to a completely different excavation area about 70 meters to the south. I have to say, I was amazed at the large extent of these excavations, as well as by the preservation and impressiveness of the Neolithic structures they've exposed. These were also founded on bedrock, some of them relatively large, with rounded floors and peripheral benches cut into the bedrock, much like the so-called communal buildings in the northern excavation area. And many of them with T-shaped pillars. At least one of the larger structures seemed to have benches all the way around, similar to the building in the northern area. However, at least a couple of the large structures only had benches in one corner. The buildings with benches appeared to come closest to a circular plan. Other buildings were more irregular in shape, but most of them still had two or more pillars. The structures are built directly against one another in an agglutinative manner, and the stone walls often show niches. Like the northern area, most or all of these buildings appear to belong to the early PPNB in the mid to late 9th millennium BC. Some of the T-pillars are carved with anthropomorphizing features, such as arms, belts, or V-shaped necklines, but they're considerably smaller than the largest pillars at Göbekli Tepe. I also noticed one example of one of the so-called portal stones in one of the excavation areas. The excavators at Göbekli Tepe interpret these, or at least the larger ones, as formal stone doorways that would have been set into the roofs of what they interpret as communal buildings. And they now claim that they have clear evidence that they occur within roof fall deposits. Notably, most or all of the buildings in this southern area show evidence for domestic activities, and Dr. Özdejan describes the site as a settlement. We could see lots of mortars and grinding slabs. At least one oven. And apparently the excavators have collected a lot of faunal bone and have been doing lots of sampling for plant remains. There was at least one example of a burned area on a floor that might be the location of a hearth. I also noticed at least one clear example of a sickle blade lying on the surface near one of the excavation areas, suggesting that the residents of these buildings were engaged in grain harvesting. The people in my group found it hard to tear themselves away and get back to the buses because there was so much to see at this site. One of my fellow travelers on this site visit was Gary Rollifson, co-director of the excavations at the Jordanian Neolithic site, Ain Ghazal, and more recently on Neolithic fieldwork in Jordan's eastern desert. After examining all this very exciting architecture, we moved back to the buses so that we could press on to our next site, the site of